Human beings are simply ambivalent about harming one another. Right? So we have this interesting combination, don't we, of altruism and cooperation and violence. One view is that human beings are innately bloodthirsty, dangerous creatures, and that our warlike tendencies are constrained only by culture. And left to our own devices, we would rampage, rape, and kill, and so on. The other view is that we are by nature cooperative, benign primates, and that culture corrupts us, culture leads us to commit atrocities on one another. So they're really mirror images of one another. Man, the killer ape, versus man, the benign, noble savage. You know, we have vociferous proponents of both views. And it's actually not clear-cut if we look at our recent history that the killer ape idea wins out. If you look at homicide rates, for instance, they're remarkably low for a killer ape. It's also notorious that it's difficult to get combatants in close combat to kill one another. So in the military, where you're expected to kill, you're rewarded for killing, it's actually difficult to get people to the point where they can look at another person in the eye, as opposed to an unmanned drone or a long-range weapon, and blow their brains out. So the evidence is not unequivocally in favor of either view. We have a horror of killing, which is really universally acknowledged all over the world, and yet it's something that we indulge in fairly frequently. And that's a puzzle that needs explaining. Generally in war, individual combatants do not have a real motivation to go out and perform these acts. And it's the job of those who wish to get us to go out and kill to convince us that this is a good thing to do, more than a good thing to do, a noble thing to do, that it is our moral responsibility to do that it is God's will that we do that. And part of this then is the glorification of the act of slaughter, to present it as an ennobling activity, as something which is heroic, which is worthy of admiration. If this is essential to war, then it really does point to the Neolithic revolution as the beginnings of war, because this is the first time we have substantial populations making up communities, and this degree of impersonality that goes with that. So we're no longer looking at small bands of people, most of whom are related to one another, all of whom have very intimate ties with one another. We're looking at large social units. Well, we're going to Jericho. It's the oldest continuously inhabited site that we know. And it's memorable for our purposes because of the famous walls of Jericho. We need to ask ourselves, why were those walls there? And there's an obvious explanation for that. Those walls were there to keep people out. So this is a really interesting, a really, really early, freakishly early example of a fortified settlement. Most of the fortified settlements that we know of were built considerably later. Jericho was a pioneering venture, and this was a massive architectural achievement. This was the New York City of the Neolithic period. As soon as you start studying the history of war, you learn about Jericho. It's a central piece of evidence about the antiquity of war. It's not been uncontested. I mean, it has been argued that the walls of Jericho were designed as protection against flooding. To my mind, that's always been an implausible interpretation. I mean, if you consider the sheer scale of the structure, the amount of effort it took to build these very, very thick walls and this lookout tower as well, all of this evidence really points towards protection from people. So, you know, this is really the birth of war as we understand it today. War isn't in our genes, that's for sure. There's no gene for war, because war is unthinkable without culture, and genes don't code for culture. There are features of human nature that make war possible that are certainly, in some sense, in our genes. What we can say is a tendency to be suspicious of strangers is perhaps something which is genetically fixed. Certain kinds of response to competition for resources or to threat. But these are all constrained by other factors. I mean, we're culturally embedded animals. Our species is extraordinarily social. I mean, we're so sociable that it gets dangerous for us because we're only interested in one another. As population increased, resources became scarcer and scarcer. And then it became advantageous for these tightly knit, highly social, altruistic communities to compete with one another for resources. And then, of course, you get war and you get violence. And part of our makeup seems to be a tendency to cut the world in terms of us and them, insiders and outsiders. We live in a world of imagined communities. We were here in Jerusalem. People will talk about the Jewish community or the Muslim community. Well, these are invented communities. A community is a group of people whose lives are intertwined, who recognize one another, who see one another. These are incredible abstractions. Most members of the so-called Jewish community have never encountered one another and never will encounter one another. So it is a purely imagined community. But what we can do as human beings is we draw these very interesting boundaries and we can modify them and shift them and extrude others, subgroups from our group who are then placed as the enemy to be destroyed, or we can form alliances and include others into our group. And of course, when you exclude, then the scene is set for a further denigration of the excluded ones, leading ultimately to license for terrible atrocities, which we find, of course, littering our history. We have a horror of bloodshed. We have a horror of cruelty. This is universally acknowledged, that taking human life is something wicked, something to be abhorred. And at the same time, we perpetuate atrocity. We harm, we hurt, we kill members of our own kind. And therefore, we have ways of overcoming our own deep inhibitions against killing. Now, it's very, very important to understand, I think, that these are both deeply rooted, probably ultimately biologically rooted aspects of human nature. It is not that one is more fundamental than the other, but the two dynamics contest with one another for possession of the human heart.